Hello, so I'm David Carpenter. I'm a Professor of Medieval History at King's College London, and I suppose you could say I was an expert on the reign of Henry III. I just brought out a big biography of Henry III with the Yale University Press, which I thoroughly recommend, especially in the paperback edition, which has corrected some of the errors in the hardback. Anyway, today I'm talking about one of the most traumatic periods in Henry III's life, when he was the captive of Simon de Montfort between the battles of Lewes and Evesham. And it's a fascinating period really, because on the one hand the king has no control over events, he's a prisoner, and yet on the other hand there's an extraordinary source which reveals his piety in this period, how he was hearing all kinds of special masses for the Virgin Mary, for Thomas Becket, and for his patron saint Edward the Confessor. And I think in some ways what was happening here was Henry was on the one hand appealing for these people to intercede, for the confessor to intercede with him, to save him. And yet on the other hand he was telling everybody, look, I am a good and pious king. I shouldn't be treated like this. And that's in a way why Henry III survived this terrible period, because there was never any effort to depose Henry III like there had been to depose his evil father, King John. And I think that's the theme of the talk I'll be giving today, how Henry saved himself.
Please welcome Professor David Carpenter.
Well, thank you, David, for that introduction. And can I thank the Mortimer History Society, the Simon de Montfort Society, and the Vale of Evesham Historical Society for putting on this event today. And could I also echo what David has said so rightly about Iris Pinkstone? I think I remember giving probably one of the very first talks of the Simon de Montfort Society, was it back in 1988? Sometime around then, and Iris has been there ever since. And I remember talking to her on the phone only a day or two before she died. So she was a great and good person who has contributed tremendously to the history, to Evesham itself, and to our understanding of Simon de Montfort. So, for good or ill, I have nothing to project on the screen. I'm just going to talk for, how long do I supposed to go on for? I'm not quite sure.
About 45 minutes,
About
David.
45 minutes.
And then there'll be a few minutes for questions.
Okay, all right, so I'll make sure I don't go any longer than that. So, the captive king. As you all know, on the 14th of May 1264, at the Battle of Lewes, Henry III was captured by his brother-in-law, Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester. Captured too was Henry's son, Lord Edward, and his brother, Richard of Cornwall, King of the Romans. And for the next 14 months, Henry III was essentially a captive of Simon de Montfort, who was the real ruler of Evesham, ruler of England. And as you all know, that lasted until Montfort's death here at Evesham on the 4th of August 1265. Well, I think this period of captivity has always excited considerable interest from the point of view of Henry, and there's in particular an article by Dr. Ben Wild about it called The Captive King, to which I owe much and from which I have shamelessly borrowed the title of the talk. Now, just a word first of background. So Henry III, he was born 1207. He came to the throne in 1216, age 9, son of King John, in the middle of the Great Civil War provoked by John's rejection of Magna Carta. I think Henry's winning of the war, or the winning of the war of the minority government, owed a great deal to a complete change of course, the acceptance of Magna Carta, which was in a way accepting everything the opposition barons had been fighting for. Well, gradually in the 1220s and 1230s, Henry's will became more and more important as he grew up in the running of government, especially after 1234, when the last of the great ministers inherited from his father quitted the political scene. So what was Henry like? Well, which I think is an important question to ask when we consider his period of captivity. We get lots of glimpses of him through the chroniclers of the period, particularly Matthew Paris, but the great source for getting really close to Henry, probably closer than any other medieval king, are things called the Chancery Rolls. They are currently wonderfully kept by the current president of the Mortimer Society and his colleagues, Dr. Drybra, in the National Archives at Kew. These are wonderful rolls which record a large proportion of the letters the king was issuing, and there are thousands and thousands of letters they record every year. Now, many of the letters are bog standard administrative letters, but many others are very, very personal to the king and can get us very close to what he was like. And I won't go into the detail of it, but this type of source doesn't exist for previous kings and doesn't really exist in the same way for kings of the 14th and 15th century. So what was Henry like? Well, he was warm-hearted, open-handed, profligate in giving gifts to those he loved. He was quick to anger, but also quick to calm down. On the whole, he was easygoing. He had none of his father's manipulation and cruelty. It's very unlike his father in that respect. And he was also, again, unlike his father, deeply pious. And the devotion to his patron saint, the last Anglo-Saxon king of the true line, Edward the Confessor, becomes in the end central to his being. And it was in honour of Edward the Confessor that we have Henry's, in some ways, greatest achievement, the rebuilding of Westminster Abbey. Because Westminster Abbey, we have it today, the great national coronation church, essentially built by Henry III. Henry was ambitious, but he was also physically lazy. And he had absolutely no gift or no interest in the business of war. He was, as contemporaries said, a rex pacificus. Perhaps that helps explain too what happened to him at Evesham. Now, these characteristics of the king help account for a long period of domestic peace in his reign, and that was linked to an absence of foreign war. And Henry, when he needed to justify himself, would constantly say, you know, I've been a peacemaker, I've created all this peace for the country. And that was accepted. Matthew Paris, other chroniclers, praise Henry for the long period of peace. And so in a way, Henry was an ideal king, from what I've said so far, for the post-Magna Carta era, for, you know, new form of kingship, which can't be the kind of aggressive kingship, intrusive kingship of his predecessors. Unfortunately, that's only one half of the story, and unless we think about the other half, we can't understand the Great Revolution of 1258, the imposition on the king of the series of reforms called the Provisions of Oxford, which were far more radical than Magna Carta, and essentially took the government of England out of Henry's hands. So how can this have happened to a pious, comparatively easygoing, affable, accessible king? The answer was two other fatal characteristics, a combination of simplicity. People constantly said of Henry that he's a rex simplex, he's simplex, which I think meant naive more than anything else, a combination of simplicity and ambition, fatal combination. The ambition came out in Henry's, and this is where the warm-hearted, expansive side of him came out. His ambition to establish in England his foreign relatives, his half-brothers from Poitou, his wife's uncles and their satellites from Poitou. And as Andrew Spencer has shown, you know, this created huge tension at court. There were periods when Henry seemed to be dominated by his foreign relatives, and that was a major aspect of the crisis of 1258. Another area where we have ambition and simplicity combined was Henry's madcap scheme to place his second son on the throne of Sicily, responding to a papal offer of the throne. It was crazy, and it totally alienated the church, who had to pay huge sums of money to the papacy in return for absolutely nothing. Now, the third area, problematic area, was Henry's failure to reform the realm, failure to reform the workings of local government. And I think that was because, unlike the King Louis IX of France, his contemporary, Henry didn't have a sense that kingship and justice were intimately linked, that he had to do justice because that was what kings were supposed to do, and also to save his soul. This was integral to his own salvation. I wonder whether Henry's piety let him down there, because he's so sure of his own righteousness, building Westminster Abbey, alms to the poor, hearing lots of masses, that he sort of thinks, well, that's enough. Surely everyone will understand I'm a good and pious king. But the result was, it was very easy to say that Henry was basically governing for himself. And of course that's with one of the definitions of a tyrant, governing for yourself, not for the kingdom. I think it was absurd in a way, and people felt it was absurd to actually call Henry personally a tyrant, and that was never done. It just doesn't work. It works for King John, but nonetheless it made it seem as though his rule, and England under his rule, was sort of country out of joint. I ought to mention one other, of course, characteristic of him, which I'll come back to a little bit later on, which of course, building Westminster Abbey, yes, of course, central to Henry, he was a connoisseur of art and architecture. And a lot of these letters are all about that. Henry had an acute eye for architectural detail, for architectural beauty, for beauty in painting. So, this is a real connoisseur of a king. So I think against this background, you can understand how grievous it was for Henry to be made a captive. He loved in an expansive way to give gifts to the people he loved and cherished. He loved building works, making his homes comfortable. He loved directing policy, often on very misguided lines. And all that is now taken from him. So how bad was it for Henry between Lewis and Evesham? And I think the answer to that is very bad. Now, that's not a universal view. In the chroniclers, the Bury chronicler says of the barons, they did not keep him as a captive, but courteously treated him as their lord. This is of the period between Lewis and Evesham. Well, yes and no. I think that's true in the sense that Henry was not kept imprisoned in a castle like King Richard was and like Lord Edward was. They were simply confined in castles, and for a while they were actually fettered. Well, nothing like that happened to Henry, but in other ways, his position is just humiliating and almost impossible. And let's have a look at that. First of all, of course, he has no control any longer over the running of government. After Lewis, the government of England was invested a council of 9 ministers, and they were chosen by 3 electors. And Simon de Montfort was one of the 3 electors. And basically, the 9 and the 3 govern England. Henry has I'll come on to his role. It's a slightly discussable one, but fundamentally, I don't think he has any role in that at all. Essentially, Simon de Montfort is the governor of England in this period. Now, Henry also had to put up with changes to his entourage. All his own people are expelled from court. He's surrounded by people he doesn't like and often doesn't know. The London chronicler Arnold Fitzstedmar says that Henry's household was removed from him. So out go these stewards of the household, Robert Aguillon and Roger of Leyburn. Leyburn is in fact now a fugitive in Thanet, being hunted down at the house of his mistress, according to rumours sweeping the countryside. In come the Essex knight, Walter of Crepping, the Lincolnshire magnate, Adam de Newmarsh, strangers to Henry. They'd never been at court before. And Simon de Montfort himself hand-picked the Kentish knight, Stephen Soudam, to come in as the marshal of Henry's household. So, Henry's, and then with other ministers of the regime, Peter de Montfort, Ralph de Camoys, Roger de St. John, these people form a very tight ring around the king. And, these are people he doesn't... Giles de Argentan was another one. These people had never been Henry's favourites. He didn't like them, and yet he's now surrounded by them. Henry was also made sort of a captive in the months after Lewis as to where he lived. So after the battle, he finally reaches Westminster, at the end of May, and he spends 2 days at his palace at Westminster. And then he's taken off. And where does he live? In the bishop's house at St Paul's, the house of the Bishop of London. And he's there all the way through from the 30th of May to the 11th of August. Well, this must have been horrific for Henry, kept apart from Westminster Abbey, from the shrine of Edward the Confessor, being made to live in the house of the Bishop of London, in London. And of course the point was he must have been virtually a captive there, because the Bishop of London, Henry of Sandwich, is an absolute committed Montfortian. He is one of the Council of Nine, and he and his entourage must essentially have been watching over Henry. And of course London itself is absolutely totally committed to Montfort's cause. So, Henry's in a way double imprisoned. He's imprisoned in the Bishop of London's house, and he's also imprisoned in London itself. Now, in a way, the situation gets worse from January 1265 onwards, when we have the great Parliament of Simon de Montfort, about which Sophie Ambler has given a lot of new light. Better for Henry in that from January to April, while the Parliament's on, he is now allowed to live in Westminster. I wish I'd know where he was, whether he was in his own palace, in his great chamber, or I wonder whether he was kept more out of the way in perhaps the house of the Abbot of Westminster. We don't know that. What we do know, though, is that the entourage gets even more unpleasant, because up till this point, the keeper of Henry's wardrobe, and the wardrobe is the sort of office that travels with the king, responsible for keeping all the money for his day-to-day expenses and so on. Up till now, Henry's keeper of the wardrobe, Henry of Ghent, had remained in place, but he's now dismissed at the beginning of the Parliament, and he's replaced by Ralph of Sandwich, a knight who is a nephew of the Bishop of London, Henry of Sandwich. And what we have are some of the accounts of Ralph of Sandwich from January 1265 onwards, amazing documents, all the way through to the Battle of Evesham. And what they show is Henry's diminished state, because basically the daily cost of his food, drink, almsgiving is down to about £9 a day. Well, that's still quite a lot of money. It's more than half the annual income of a poor knight. But it compares very poorly with the daily expenditure on food, drink, almsgiving in normal years, which are often £16, £20 a day. So you can see Henry's being made to live very, very quietly. Even worse for Henry, there's almost a total cessation of what he loves most, gift giving. And between January and August, his gift-giving of rings, brooches, belts for knights, it just almost ceases. In that period, he only gave away 2 rings, whereas in most years, in his free, rings would be given 10, 20 a week. I mean, it's just simply no longer, and you sort of feel that must indicate he's being very, very closely isolated, monitored, and just not able to get out and, try and make his case to people by giving them things. One entry in Sandwich's account, to which Ben Wild has drawn attention, is that there's also a payment made to certain mounted sergeants staying with the king through the same time. And you wonder whether these mounted sergeants are actually there less to protect him as to watch him and make sure he doesn't try and get away. I won't go on with this, but Henry also had to put up with the regime making free with his own possessions to reward themselves. And one particularly personal form of gift was often the gift from the royal forests of deer and wood either for firewood or for building. And these are very important gifts, because if if you're eating the venison the king has given you, you think, oh gosh, I'm really grateful to him. Or if you're warming yourself at the fire from the firewood the king has given you, you think the same. And of course, more permanently, you can always think, gosh, the rafters over my head were given me by the king. Well, all that stops. Or it doesn't stop. What happened was that it was just the leading members of the regime who are now getting all these gifts. Now, just finally to come back to the government here, what time ought I to stop? Tell me that. to make quite sure. I'll stop on the dot, even if I haven't finished, even if I haven't got to the Battle of Evesham. Well, that'd be better, because
you've got another 20 minutes, about 10:50.
I might go on a little bit longer than that, but we'll see.
I'm sure Sophie can...
No, Sophie shan't be any less. I certainly stop by sort of 5. So, actually, this one. Be quiet.
25.
Okay. So,
25.
okay, all right, well, we'll see. 25 minutes. Okay, so one very important... I want to finally come back on this note to to government, what happened in government. And I say Henry is taken out of Henry's hands. But there is a fascinating difference here. And you can see it from what's called the authorization notes to royal letters. Many of these letters I'm talking about have a little authorization note saying who personally authorized them. So it might be by Simon de Montfort, by the king, by the council. Now, in the first revolution of 1258, Henry is totally uninvolved in government, and indeed he said he was treated, the council took no notice of anything I said, and all the authorization notes don't mention him at all. There's just by the council, by a minister. Whereas between Lewis and Evesham, what's extraordinary is that Henry is constantly being involved in these authorization notes. So a letter might be issued by the king, Simon de Montfort and the council, or by the king, in other words, named councillors like Walter of Crepping or Giles de Argentan, Hugh de Spencer. In other words, Henry is being made to cooperate with the regime and give his imprimatur to his acts. Now, it's possible this is just a sort of, his name's being used without his knowledge, but I suspect, in fact, he is cooperating to some extent. He's been made to cooperate. That also raises the question of how far he was spayed in public, and Sophie may be able to help us on this. The Great Parliament of 1265, there's no evidence he actually spoke. On the other hand, later on, when the men of Bristol queried a order, this is after the Parliament, they were told to come bring 12 men who could actually see the king, and the king could actually vouch for what they were being ordered to do. So it seems as though they thought he was safe there. I don't know. On the whole, I think he didn't. I think he was kept out of the way. Now, all this makes Henry seem very unheroic. And, you wonder, well, why didn't he make more of a stand? There's one piece of evidence he did make a stand over one issue, but I'll leave that out. Why didn't he show more courage, make more of a stand, refuse to cooperate? Well, I think you've got to think he is under intense pressure. He's alone. His wife is, of course, in exile in France, he's quite alone, and I think he feels he's being threatened with deposition. The Merton chronicler, writing afterwards favourable to the king, says that he only accepted Simon de Montfort's form of government when threatened with deposition. And there were certainly threats of deposition going around. One letter he was made to write to Louis IX spoke of the danger of the perpetual disinheritance of us and our heirs. And there must have been 2 periods of acute tension when the invasion was threatened by Henry's queen in the autumn of 1264. And then, of course, after Edward's escape, which I'll come on to if I have time, in 1265. Because Henry asked, well, my God, what's going to happen? And in particular, what will happen if it all goes wrong, if the invasion's defeated, if Edward's defeated? I think he thought that would be the end of the dynasty. And my own view, and people may differ on it, is that Montfort actually thought, yes, bring it on, bring it on. I'd love to have another war in which I can finally get rid of them and be crowned king myself. No constitutional impediment to that, of course. King John had actually been deposed by the rebellious barons, and indeed, when there was a plot to murder King John, who, according to one rumour, was going to be offered the throne, but Simon de Montfort's father. So no constitutional impediment. So that brings me on to a slightly different question. How did Henry regard this period? One view might be that he regarded it as sort of just judgment on him for his own ill conduct. The Bishop of Lincoln in 1261 in one letter said, the Lord has many times brought over us the waves of his indignation by his just judgment. for man suffers nothing unjustly. So, did Henry think that? Did he think I did rule badly and so on? I'm not so sure. I think a different view would be that what he thought was that Montfort was the agent of Antichrist, the agent of the devil. And it was the devil who was doing all this. Now, the Franciscan friar Adam Marsh, in one of his letters, explained how the devil, by his breath, by his embrace, by his deadly lash, produces mortally dangerous division. At the present day, the last of the perilous times, remember this is, we're coming up to the end of time, the apocalypse. In the perilous times that are now upon us, he stirs up deadly discord so as utterly to destroy the offspring of peace. With his lash, inflicting violent injuries, with confusion seducing men with massive deception, he ceases not to harass the whole world with his monstrous insolence. Well, I think Henry thought that's Montfort. This is what's happening here, that Montfort is the agent of the devil. And of course, Henry's very familiar with the events of the last days from these wonderful illustrated apocalypses, which are now circulating amongst the English nobility. And one of the most splendid, known as the Trinity apocalypse, quite possibly owned by the royal family. There you can see Antichrist in the form of a seven-headed beast, leading out his force of heavily armoured warriors, sitting astride a splendidly caparisoned horse. And one of the warriors in this army of Antichrist is carrying a shield depicting none other than the arms of Simon de Montfort, silver lion with a forked tail. Now, the Trinity Apocalypse is a work of the 1250s, so it's, probably isn't actually referring to perhaps just nice arms. But of course, if Henry looked at that 10 years later, he thought, my God, how prophetic, that's exactly what's happening. So, terribly worrying, but of course there is hope, because the next thing in the Trinity Apocalypse shows the army of the beast, the army of Antichrist. It shows an angel pushing the beast down into the jaws of hell, while the bodies of his knights lie prostrate and food for birds, a bit like Montfort's knights after Evesham. So Henry had hope, but I think he had hope for another more major reason, and that is throughout this period he's constantly praying to the Virgin Mary, to Thomas Becket, and above all to Edward the Confessor, to basically rescue him from the situation he's in. And we know this from another extraordinary survival from this period, which is Henry's oblation roll. It's a roll recording his offerings at Mass all the way through from January to July 1265. It's been studied by Ben Wild, Antonio Schapfog and other people very, very interestingly. Now, in this period, from January to July, he had several, these are special masses, because he hears Mass every day, but you can hear a special Mass of the Virgin Mary, which Henry does, special Mass of Becket, occasionally he does. Above all, though, he hears this special Mass of Edward the Confessor 21 times between January and July. And how comforting this special Mass of the Confessor must have been, because the hymns sung during the Mass went through all the miracles and wonders of the Edward the Confessor, including the way the Earl, in this case not Montfort but Earl Godwin, had choked to death on the bread the Confessor had blessed. So how Henry III must have wished that's going to happen to me with Montfort. And then this is the Psalm 20, which is in the Mass. The Lord rejoices in thy might, O Lord. Well may he exult in thy victory. For thou hast given him his heart's desire, and hast not refused him what he asked. Your hand shall reach all your enemies. Your right hand shall reach those that hate you. The Lord in his anger will strike your enemies down, and fire shall consume them. It will exterminate their offspring from the earth and rid mankind of their prosperity. For they have aimed wicked blows at you. They have plotted mischief, but could not prevail. Wow, well, how no wonder Henry wanted to hear that again and again and again. There's just some reason to think from the roll, and I won't go into the detail here, that Henry again was kept out of the Abbey, not allowed to be public, until after Easter. when Henry did make a demonstration in London, and I think Montfort wasn't there anymore. He'd gone to Evesham, as Louise Wilkinson has shown in a wonderful book I recommend, published by the Pipe Roll Society, of the household role of Eleanor, Montfort's wife, Henry's sister, which shows her food and drink all through this time. Anyway, Montfort had left London, left Henry, and gone to Evesham for Easter. And Henry then does get out. On Good Friday, he adored the Holy Cross in the Abbey, left beneath it 1 piece of gold, 12 gold coins. And then he goes on a peregrination through the churches of London, distributing 49 shillings sixpence in alms. The day before Maundy Thursday, he'd given fed 100 paupers and probably washed their feet in a great bowl in the wardrobe kept for that purpose. So on Easter Day itself, he heard 2 masses, one in the Abbey, left 10 gold pieces at the high altar and the shrine of the confessor. Well, you wonder, Henry's obviously desperately hoping the confessor will intercede for him. But I think he is trying to demonstrate here to the people, I'm a good and pious king. These things should not be happening to me. And as he progresses through London, all the London churches, I'm sure that's what he hopes is going to happen. I think also, of course, I'm going to leave out the detail here. You've got to remember Westminster Abbey is just growing up at this time, the 4 bays of the nave. So towering above everything that's going on at Westminster is the great church Henry's created. It gives even more powerfully the same message. Now, I'm going to come on in the last quarter of an hour to look at the final phase then, the move to Hereford and the events leading up to Evesham. Henry left Westminster on the 16th of April 1265, went to Northampton, Gloucester, and ultimately to Hereford, where he arrived on the 8th of May. And of course, Montfort is with him, and the Lord Edward is with him too. And this introduces a fascinating change in the whole running of government, and one Henry must have felt even more uncomfortable with, because previously Montfort had let the council get on with it and had always been at arm's length from actually Henry's physical presence. And that reached a climax at Christmas 1264, where Montfort has this wonderful Christmas with all his knights at Kenilworth, and Henry has a lonely, quiet Christmas at Woodstock. They're not together. And mostly that's true of the whole period down to basically the move to Hereford, because Montfort's holding his own court and he pulls the strings of the councillors, doesn't have to be there himself. But from now onwards, Henry and Montfort are together, and whereas before Montfort authorised personally very few letters, he's now authorising lots and lots of them. So Henry and Montfort are together in very uncomfortable proximity. While they gone to Hereford, of course, that Montfort had quarrelled disastrously with his only great baronial supporter, Gilbert de Clare, Earl of Gloucester. And Montfort had gone to the Welsh marches in order, basically, to try and deal with him. Well, like all visitors to Hereford, Henry must have been disturbed by the cry of the seagulls coming up from the Wye, flying over the town and the castle, their anguished cries, and perhaps that summed up his own mood. On the other hand, and again the oblation roll helps here, there was consolation, because the cathedral's patron saint was a king even more unfortunate than Henry himself, and this is the Ethelbert murdered by King Offa, or as St Albans Abbey preferred to believe, because of course Offa was their founder, by Offa's nefarious queen. Ethelbert's body had been buried at Hereford, but his head was preserved at Westminster Abbey, so Henry already knew his story. Anyway, now the oblation rolls shows on 6 occasions between 11th of May, 26th of May, he went to the cathedral and made offerings at Ethelbert's relics, and this has been studied by Antonio Chapel. One of the occasions was the feast day of the saint himself, which fell on the 20th of May. Another was the feast of Pentecost, when Henry fed 100 paupers. One hopes actually these celebrations not marred by illness or anxiety, because on the day before Pentecost, the king's wardrobe brought a medicine described as a stomach comforter, from an apothecary in Hereford. Gosh, I hadn't thought of this before, and I shall alter this. So the day before Pentecost was the... No, wait a minute. What day was Pentecost? Oh, no, never mind. I'll have to check this up another time. Sorry. Maybe I'm not right about that. Henry was also there for the dedication of the new transept built by Bishop Aigueblanche, and I have written a purple passage about how he appreciated the new architecture there and the wonderful transept that Bishop Aigueblanche modelled in part on Westminster Abbey, but I will spare you that in the interests of time. So I now come finally to the final thing, and of course the crucial moment is the 19th of May, when in one of the most famous individual exploits of the 13th century, indeed the medieval period, Lord Edward escaped from captivity at Hereford, and you all know the story of how he was allowed madly by Montfort to go outside the city walls to sort of test out horses, and he tires them all out and then gallops off on the last one, which is still has its breath, and sort of waves goodbye. Well, from that moment, and then he joins up with Gilbert de Clare, Earl of Gloucester, and they break down all the bridges and hollow out the fords of the Severn, and so Montfort is trapped behind the River Severn. And so what should he do? Well, Montfort, of course, was a brilliant soldier and was not without recourse, and I still think he thought, I can win this, and I'm pleased about this. I mean, he now announces that Edward has lost all his rights to the throne and everything. So, you know, the next step is deposition. I think Montfort says, again, as I said, bring it on. And what is his plan? It's to join up with a great army being gathered by his son, Simon de Montfort Jr., the other side of the Severn. But the problem is to get across the Severn. And the first thing they did was to move southwards to Newport, try and be ferried across the Bristol Channel. I was at Newport to sort of trace this, and I won't again spare you the purple passages of the description of the journey. But unfortunately, when they got to Newport, Newport's well worth going up to the top to look at the site of the cathedral where the castle was, and you look out over the Severn estuary and the Usk going into it, and Montfort must have looked and looked, hoping the ships were coming across from Bristol to ferry him across, and they didn't come because Gilbert de Clare and Lord Edward destroyed the shipping. So that meant Henry had, in the end, to get back to Hereford, and again, I'll spare you the purple passages I've written about the journey, we'll get back to Hereford. So Henry was back at Hereford finally after this futile trip to the Severn estuary on the 19th of July. There's just one and of course by this time no royal letter, the Chancery rolls have ceased to record anything and so on. There's just one fascinating document actually which Nicholas Vincent pointed out to me in the Herefordshire archives from these very, very last days of the Montfortian regime, and that's a letter issued, or charter issued by Henry III on the 24th of July in the Herefordshire Record Office, where it's probably already been. It's in favour of a Hereford citizen called Thomas Thebaud, and it's in compensation for the houses Thebaud have pulled down on the King's orders, Montfort's orders, outside one of the gates in order to be able to defend the town. And he's now granted land of Mansell, a Jew of Hereford. The charter's witnessed by Simon de Montfort, Hugh de Spencer, Peter de Montfort, Giles de Argentan, Roger de St John, the steward Walter of Crepping, the marshals Stephen Soudan and Bartholomew Bigod. Apart from Bigod, all these men were Henry's enemies. Nearly all of them would be dead within a week. The charter is very neatly written and preserves fragments of Henry's seal. I just wonder whether the Chancery clerk who wrote it was trying to make a point in Henry's favour, because he decorates the H of Henry's name at the start, Henricus, and across the top of it draws what looks like a crown. So, you know, maybe he's thinking this isn't going to last much longer. I don't think Montfort thought that at all. I think until the end he thought, you know, God is on my side. So in conclusion, I'll now come, I went to Evesham itself and Henry's experiences there. And I suppose all of us taking that long straight road out of Evesham, over the railway line, past those red brick houses lined by trees until we come to the top of Green Hill, we all have a feeling of frisson, the horror of the events of that day. I think, what happened exactly, all one can do is really narrate the different accounts. They arrive at the Abbey of Evesham before the first hour, dawn's 4:45, so, very early in the day. And I think at that point, Montfort has no inkling that for last he's been out-generalled and that Edward has been following him through the night. I think he thinks he's thrown them off, otherwise they would never have stopped in Evesham. So it's only, I think, 3 hours later the dreadful news arrives that Edward is there above the hill. So arrived in the Abbey, the first thing I think was mass and then food. Thomas Wykes, the chronicler, states that the king and the earl heard mass early in the morning and ate a little. Waverley Abbey analyst, by contrast, has Henry eating and Montfort refusing food. I think there's sort of obviously religious overtone there. Robert of Gloucester's account, Henry refuses to continue until he has eaten. As I say, here and elsewhere, one can only narrate the different accounts of this traumatic and terrible day. If Henry and Montfort heard mass together, this was probably the last time outside the battle. They were in each other's company. After the mass meal, was Henry able to lie down for a while, perhaps in the abbot's lodgings? Shouldn't think he could get much sleep. At least the Montfortians remained undisturbed in Evesham between the time of their arrival and around the third hour of the day, that's sort of 8:30. And then, of course, the catastrophic news arrived that Edward was upon them and was barring the route north. Sorry, I should have explained that obviously the purpose of coming to Evesham was to then march north and join up with the Montfort son, who would be coming down from Kenilworth. Montfort was then at his most heroic and decided to go out and fight, perhaps, thinking this is the end, as Dr. Ambler suggested, all my father, my kin have all died in a righteous cause, and now I will too. Or perhaps, never quite knowing that maybe his son was going to arrive, and miracles had happened before, if God is on your side. If Henry hoped to be left behind in the Abbey, he was obviously disappointed. He was going too. According to one narrative, he was kitted out in a suit of Montfort's own armour. He was also equipped from his own wardrobe with 2 silken belts worked with silver, weighing over 1.5 pounds. I think one may doubt whether any sword was hanging from them. So they march up or ride up to the top of Green Hill, and there the forces close in. I suppose one can only imagine Henry in the midst of that dark and fearful slaughter, glimpsing through the eyepiece of his helmet the raining down of blows, hearing the continuous roar produced by the clash of arms and the shouts and screams of angry and dying men. According to one narrative, he cried out in a loud voice, "I am Henry of Winchester, your king. Do not kill me." The Melrose chronicler has him shouting, "I am Henry, the old king of England. For the love of God, do not hit me, for I am too old to fight." I suppose if he was in a suit of Montfort's armour, of course that would depend how much Montfort's blazons were on it, there was a real danger of him being mistaken for Montfort himself, who of course the royalists were absolutely determined to kill. Both the belts Henry had worn were lost in the battle, presumably wrenched from him in the melee. In the end, he was wounded in the shoulder, and his helmet was pulled off, And of course, with most of the others, that would be a prelude to having your throat cut and being stabbed to death. But mercifully, he's recognised by Knight Adam onto Alto. And then, these are all the various accounts, he was hurried to safety by Henry himself. It's been an appalling experience, one of the narratives says, for this simple man, peaceable and warlike. So that's almost my account, the end of my account. Henry had survived and was to live another 7 years. There would be 2 years before peace came back to England. Now, as I've said, in many ways, Henry's performance in this period seems extremely heroic. There are 1 or 2 indications which I've left out of him making a stand against Montford. And obviously he owed his rescue, the re-establishment of his kingship, to his son, to Lord Edward, who was a very, very different proposition. Of course, he also owed it to Montfort's own mistakes, and particularly the break-up with Gilbert of Clare. But I think he also owed it to himself, because although I think Montfort was moving towards deposition and would have deposed Henry and Edward if they hadn't been killed at Evesham, assuming he'd won Evesham, he was not able to do it in any of the great parliaments between the 2 great parliaments between Lewes and Evesham. It was never on the agenda. Why wasn't it on the agenda? It was because I think Henry was widely regarded as a good, well, in some ways a good, but certainly a very deeply pious man. And he was not a cruel, manipulative person like his father. And I think people shied away from deposing or thinking of deposing a king of that type. And Henry, of course, had done things in this period between Lewes and Evesham to actually show that he was a good, and I've talked about the almsgiving, the building of Westminster Abbey, the parade round London. I mean, all those things showed it. So at the end, at the very start of his life of Edward the Confessor, this really is the end, Matthew Paris talks about England being blessed with so many wonderful kings. And he makes a distinction: some were mighty and very bold, like Arthur, obviously, like Alfred. Others were wise, peaceable, and well-tempered, trempre. Well, I don't think you could have said Henry was wise, but he was certainly peaceable, and in many ways he was well-tempered. And I think it's interesting that Paris thought, you don't have to be a great warlike king in order to be a success. And in many ways, Henry was a success. He ruled England in peace for very many years. Okay, it was some ways peace and injustice. And I think the peace would have lasted for the whole of his reign if it hadn't been for Simon de Montfort. So thank you very much. Thank you, David. That was